A few weeks ago, I made a video on Dorohedoro Season 1. In that video, I talked about how the show's main protagonist, Cayman, doesn't feel like a hero. And on the other side, N doesn't feel like a typical villain either. Now, to be fair, calling Cayman the protagonist and N the antagonist was mostly my own assumption based on how Season 1 was presented. I wasn't sure whether that observation would continue to hold true in Season 2. After finishing Season 2, I think that observation was correct, and this season gave me several reasons to believe it. The first reason appeared in the very first episode. When I started Season 2, I expected the story to continue following Cayman. After all, he was the character through whom we had experienced most of the story in Season 1. However, after finishing the first episode, I realized something surprising. Cayman did not appear at all. What surprised me even more was the fact that I did not notice his absence while I was watching the episode. Usually, when a story begins a new season after a long gap, the main character is brought back immediately. The audience is reminded why they are important, and the story quickly reconnects us with them. Dorohedoro does not do that. Instead, the episode focuses on other characters, expands the world, and develops storylines that do not involve Cayman. The remarkable part is that the episode remains engaging throughout. At no point was I sitting there waiting for Cayman to appear. The side characters, the world, and the ongoing mysteries were interesting enough to carry the entire episode by themselves. For me, that says a lot about the quality of the writing. A story that depends entirely on its protagonist cannot afford to remove that protagonist from the screen for an entire season premiere. Dorohedoro manages to do exactly that. As I continued watching, that observation became even more interesting. By the end of episode 6, it felt like the story had basically killed its main protagonist. Now yes, technically there's a lot more going on than that. Cayman's lizard face is gone. Aikawa moves to the center of the story. The cross-eyes boss becomes even more important. The identities become more complicated. But from my perspective as a viewer, the character I had spent an entire season following was suddenly gone. The version of Cayman I knew no longer existed. Naturally, I assumed that such a major change would completely alter the structure of the story. In most stories, removing or fundamentally changing a protagonist creates a huge problem, because the narrative has been built around that person. However, Dorohedoro does not stop there. In the very next episode, N also gets killed. This is the same N who had been presented as one of the most powerful and influential figures in the entire story. At that point, I found myself thinking about how unusual this situation really was. Within the span of only 2 episodes, Dorohedoro had effectively removed both the protagonist and the antagonist as I understood them. Yet the story did not lose momentum. In fact, it felt as though the story was only beginning to reveal its larger picture. This is where I started asking myself an important question. Why does this work? Why am I still completely invested in the story, even after such dramatic changes? I think the answer is the mystery. Dorohedoro has one of those mysteries that constantly pushes the audience to keep thinking. Every time the story provides an answer, it also creates new questions. Season 2 reveals more information about Cayman, Aikawa, Risu, the Cross-Eyes, and several other mysteries that have been building since the first season. Despite all of those revelations, I finished the season feeling as though there was still a huge amount left to uncover. Normally, removing a protagonist or an antagonist would create a sense of uncertainty about where the story is supposed to go next. In Dorohedoro, that uncertainty becomes part of the appeal, because the mystery itself is carrying the narrative forward. I wanted to understand what was happening. I wanted to know how all of these identities connected to each other. I wanted answers to questions that the story has been teasing for 2 seasons. Because of that, I never felt disconnected from the story, even when the characters and roles I was familiar with were changing. That is probably the thing that impressed me the most about Season 2. The season reinforced my belief that Cayman and N were never functioning as a traditional protagonist and antagonist in the first place. More importantly, it showed me that Dorohedoro is confident enough to challenge the expectations that viewers normally have about storytelling. At the same time, the mystery remains as compelling as ever. In fact, after finishing the season, I am probably more curious about the truth behind everything than I was when I started. Part of me wants to continue the story immediately by reading the manga. However, I'm going to wait because Season 3 has already been announced. After everything that happened in Season 2, I am very interested to see where this story goes next.